All around the world, we find ancient human remains and tools on islands that couldn't have been reached by foot. Even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, which means they had to cross oceans. Vast, terrifying, unpredictable oceans. Long. Before history says they could. So how did they do it? Let's start with one of the biggest clues. Australia. Modern humans arrived there at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. That's long before the invention of metal, agriculture, or even organized cities. But here's the kicker. Even during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, Australia was never connected to mainland Asia. There were still dozens of miles of open ocean to cross. So how did they do it? Researchers believe these ancient seafarers island hopped from Indonesia, navigating the complex chain of islands between Southeast Asia and Oceania. But this wasn't accidental. Models suggest the journey would have required multiple hops, some involving out-of-sight navigation. Let's be clear, that means planning. They built some form of watercraft. They had to know where to go. They had to store food, fire, and people, including elders, children, the tools of an entire culture. That's not trial and error. That's a voyage. And they didn't just survive, they thrived. Building entire societies on a continent filled with new animals, plants, and dangers. This wasn't a fluke, it was skill. So where are the boats? That's the frustrating part. They were almost certainly made from organic materials, reeds, bark, wood, fiber, the kinds of things that rot in salt water and disappear with time. But just because we haven't found the boats doesn't mean they didn't exist. We've found hints. Stone anchors, shell tools used to carve wood, sites near ancient coastlines that suggest fishing, net weaving, or maritime activity. And when we look at surviving indigenous maritime cultures, from the Polynesians to the Andaman Islanders, we see stunning examples of ocean knowledge passed down orally, not written in stone. These cultures remember the currents, the stars, the rhythm of the waves. They speak a language of the sea that may have been spoken for tens of thousands of years, and we're only just beginning to listen. Some skeptics argue that ancient people reached islands by accident, blown off course on makeshift rafts, never intending to settle, but that theory falls apart under scrutiny. Why? Because people didn't just land on one island. They colonized entire archipelagos, systematically. In the case of Australia, the earliest settlements are spread across huge regions. It requires multiple journeys, not a one-time fluke. And they brought more than just themselves. They brought tools, seeds, animals, and fire. That's not luck. That's logistics. And when you look at places like New Guinea or the Solomon Islands, the pattern is the same. Human settlement across ocean gaps too wide to swim or drift. Even the famous Lapita people who sailed across the Pacific 3,000 years ago are part of a legacy that likely stretches back to these ancient voyagers. They weren't just travelers. They were the first explorers. In Japan, there's another puzzle. Stone tools found on the southern island of Okinawa date back 30,000 years. Again, a time when the island was surrounded by water. Even during low sea levels, these tools show signs of being carried intentionally across the ocean. Yet no land bridge ever connected Okinawa to mainland Asia, which means again, they must have had boats. More than that, they had routes. Were these regular journeys? Seasonal fishing trips? The beginnings of trade? We don't know. What we do know is this. People were reaching islands far earlier than our history books. It's taught us, and every new discovery seems to push the timeline back even further. Some researchers now believe that Homo erectus, an even earlier human species, may have crossed short ocean gaps nearly 1 million years ago. That's right. A species we don't even associate with language may have been paddling between islands in Southeast Asia hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens. In fact, it's the only explanation for how Homo floresiensis ended up on the island of Flores, is that they, or their ancestors, crossed water to get there. That changes everything, because it means seafaring may be older than fire dash making, older than religion, older than art. The ocean wasn't a barrier, it was a highway. Let's go even deeper. Literally, during the Ice Age, sea levels were over 300 feet lower than today. That means vast stretches of coastline, including entire land bridges and early settlements, are now buried beneath the ocean. We've barely scratched the surface of underwater archaeology, but where we have looked, we found astonishing things in the English Channel. Divers discovered ancient human footprints on a submerged landmass called Doggerland, a region that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. In India, off the coast of Dwarka, structures lie deep underwater, their origins still debated. And in the Mediterranean and Caribbean, there are submerged stone arrangements that hint at possible human activity, now sunken and eroded beyond recognition. What stories lie beneath the waves? What tools? What boats? What entire cultures? We don't know because we haven't found them yet. But they're down there waiting long before cities, kings, or written words. There was fire, not just warmth, not just light, but something deeper, something sacred. Because once early, humans tamed fire. They didn't just cook meat or ward off predators. They gathered around it. They watched the flames dance. They told stories. And in that flickering glow, something extraordinary happened. We became more than survival machines. We became dreamers. So when did humans first control fire? It's a tricky question. Wildfires are ancient lightning started, them long before humans ever walked the earth. But taming fire? That was a whole new game. The earliest evidence of human-controlled fire dates goes back over 1 million years in places like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. Their scientists found charred bones and ash layers deep inside cave systems. Too far in to be accidental. This wasn't just stumbling upon a wildfire. It was intentional. Fire became a tool for warmth, cooking, and protection. It kept predators at bay. It softened tough roots. It made food more digestible, unlocking more calories with less effort, and with more energy came bigger brains. That's one of the most intriguing theories in anthropology, the cooking hypothesis. The idea that fire helped us evolve cognitively by giving us more time, more nutrition, and fewer parasites in our food. In other words, fire wasn't just a tool, it was an evolutionary upgrade. But what happened after the meal, when the days? Hunting or gathering was done, and people sat in a circle, warmed by glowing embers. That's when the mind came alive. Anthropologists believe the evening hours around the fire were unlike any other time. Free from predators, free from work, was a unique social space. Around the fire, humans told stories, passed down knowledge, sang, danced, maybe even dreamed together. One study on modern hunter-gatherers in Africa found that firelight conversations were 3 times more focused on storytelling and community values than daytime talk. Think about that. Fire didn't just feed us. It fed our culture. It became the cradle of memory and maybe, just maybe, the first classroom. Not long after fire came another mystery art in the dark recesses of caves across Europe, Africa, and Indonesia. Early humans painted animals, handprints, and symbols on walls. Some of these works are 40,000 years old, and possibly older. What drove them to paint in places no one could see casually? Deep, dangerous corners lit only by torches. It wasn't about decoration, it was ritual, it was meaning. Some researchers believe these spaces were spiritual, that early humans used flickering torchlight to animate the drawings, turning stationary art into something alive. Dynamic and otherworldly, they weren't just artists, they were storytellers, they were shamans. And what were they expressing? Hopes, fears, the hunt, death, stars, spirits. The raw ingredients of myth, fire has always had a sacred quality. Across the world, ancient religions revered it. In Zoroastrianism, fire is the eternal light of truth. In Hinduism, fire rituals called yajnas are central to connecting with the divine. Even in ancient Greece, the hearth was watched over by the goddess Hestia. In Rome, the Vestal Virgins guarded a flame that symbolized the heart of the empire. But these traditions didn't appear from nowhere. They grew from the campfires of early humans. Where embers sparked not just heat but reverence, fire was. Unpredictable, powerful, dangerous, mysterious. It consumed and gave life. It killed and protected. What better metaphor for the unknown? What better symbol for God? Now imagine this. A child falls asleep by the fire, listening to their elders' stories. Their eyes flutter, breath slows, and their mind begins to wander. Dreams, the subconscious theater of the brain. It's the wild, irrational, mystical world. Inside us, when did humans first wonder what dreams meant? Did they believe them to be messages from ancestors, from spirits, from the stars? We'll never know exactly, but we do know this. Every known human culture, no matter how ancient or isolated, has given meaning to dreams. They weren't seen as random. They were portals, visions, warnings, teachings, and just maybe. Dreams were the first seeds of religion, a whisper from within that said, "There's more than what you see today." We live with light at the flick of a switch. We don't need fire to survive the night. We don't sit in silence watching embers fade, but something inside us remembers. The pull of candlelight, the trance of a campfire, the hush of stars above. Because those ancient flames shaped us, they taught us patience, reflection, wonder. They gave us more than heat. They gave us time to think, to imagine, to believe. They were the backdrop for our first songs, our first fears, our first gods. And even now, in the heart of our fast-paced digital lives, we still gather around. Glowing screens, we still tell stories late into the night. We still search for meaning in the dark. We are still in some deep, timeless way, firemakers and dreamers. Imagine walking through an ancient forest. The trees are still. The air carries the quiet hum of wind through leaves. Then, in a shallow cave at the base of a cliff, you find it a grave. Not just a pile of bones, but a resting place. Carefully placed stones, flowers once left to wilt, maybe ochre on the skull, maybe a tool or a shell, gently cradled next to the body, and you realize someone mourned here thousands of years ago. Long before written language, someone stood here in silence. Someone cried, someone remembered. This isn't just death, it's grief, and that is deeply human. Let's start with a surprising twist. One of the earliest examples of intentional burial doesn't come from Homo sapiens. It comes from Neanderthals. That's right. The so-called brutes of prehistory may have been among the first to bury their dead at Shanidar Cave in Iraq. Archaeologists uncovered several Neanderthal skeletons, some dating back 60,000 years. One individual, known as Shanidar IV, was buried with pollen from wildflowers. Now, some debate whether the pollen was carried by animals, but many scientists believe the flowers were placed intentionally. Why would Neanderthals do that? Because even they, long before civilization, may have felt love, loss, reverence. This burial wasn't just disposal, it was remembrance. And that shakes our entire view of what it means to be human. Jump ahead in time to around 34,000 years ago in what is now Russia. At a site called Sunjir, archaeologists discovered a burial so astonishing it still baffles experts. A man and two children were buried wearing thousands of ivory beads painstakingly, carved and sewn into clothing. The children, possibly twins, were buried head to head, with spears made of mammoth tusk laid beside them. It would have taken hundreds of hours to create this burial ensemble. This wasn't random. This was love. This was status. This was grief, ritual, and identity. Why spend so much time on the dead? Because they weren't forgotten. They were still part of the story. Sunjir reminds us, even in the Ice Age, life and death were intimately connected. As we look across the ancient world, we find graves that tell us so much more than just someone died here. In Kafsa Cave, Israel, a young child was buried with a red deer antler resting on its chest. It's about 90,000 years ago. In Dolny Vestanas, Czech Republic, 3 teenagers were buried arm in arm, their bodies aligned with striking symmetry, as if telling a story only they understood. In Africa, at the site of Border Cave, bodies were buried with shells, pigments, and plant bedding dating back 70,000 years. These aren't accidents. These are rituals. They show intentional care. Cultural, meaning possibly even belief in something beyond death. Were they burying the body or guiding the soul? When did humans first start believing in an afterlife? Can't pin down an exact moment, but burial is one of the strongest clues. Why place objects with the dead if there's no belief they'll need them? Why decorate a corpse, or mark a grave, or return to visit it? These acts suggest early humans, and maybe even earlier hominins, believed in something beyond this life. It didn't have to be heaven or hell, but maybe a journey, a spirit, a continued presence. Death wasn't the end. It was a threshold, and crossing it was sacred. Why do we mourn? From an evolutionary perspective, grief seems almost irrational. It drains energy, distracts from survival. It hurts, but maybe that pain served a deeper purpose. Grief may have bound early humans together. It may have strengthened family ties, encouraged empathy, and reinforced community bonds, because when we lose someone, we're reminded how much they meant. And when we see others grieve, we understand love in a new way. That's powerful. Some researchers even suggest grief was part of what made Homo sapiens so successful. Empathy became our superpower. It made us take care of the wounded, protect the old, raise the orphaned. We didn't just leave the weak behind, we carried them. And in that compassion, we found our strength. Even today, when archaeologists open ancient graves, they do so with awe, because beneath the layers of time and earth lies something universal. Loss, love, remembrance. It doesn't matter if the bones are from a Paleolithic cave or a Viking ship, a 10,000-year-old infant in Alaska, or a Bronze Age chieftain in China. These graves speak of something timeless, a beating heart, a final breath, a human hand laying another to rest. They show us that we were always more than toolmakers, more than hunters, more than minds. We were. From the very beginning, hearts that broke and healed and remembered. Picture this. Two humans sit across from each other, no words, no writing, no grammar, and yet they understand. A raised eyebrow, a pointed finger, sharp intake of breath, a grunt, a whistle, a shared look of alarm. They haven't spoken a single word. But something very human just passed between them, communication, before the first sentence was ever spoken. There was language, not as we know it, but in gestures, tones, rhythms, and raw emotion. So how did we go from silent stares and body signals to the complex symphonies of speech we use today? Let's rewind way before agriculture, before cities, even before Homo sapiens. Our ancestors lived in small groups. They hunted, gathered, and survived in dangerous, unpredictable environments. But survival wasn't just about strength. It was about coordination. You needed to share plans, warnings, intentions, and long before spoken language evolved, our ancestors relied on nonverbal communication. Think about it. Pointing to signal danger, raising hands to indicate peace, mimicking, a motion to suggest an idea, shouting or humming to control group movements. Even today, these tools are hardwired into us. You wave, you shrug, you nod, you frown. No dictionary required. This was the original language felt rather than spoken. Some scientists believe that human language may have actually started with the hands, not the mouth. In fact, if you watch chimpanzees or bonobos, the great apes, closest to us, they use gestures more than vocalizations to communicate complex ideas. Could early humans have done the same? It's possible. Gestures are more visible. They're easier to control. They're incredibly versatile. What if the first sentence wasn't a sound, but a silent motion, hand shaping meaning? Over time, these gestures may have become more symbolic. A certain motion meant food, another meant danger. Eventually, perhaps, vocalizations were added to accompany the movements like captions to a movie, and once sound and meaning merged, spoken language was born. But what if the first communication wasn't about information but emotion? Some researchers propose that the earliest vocalizations weren't words, they were songs, rhythmic, melodic, emotional, long before language conveyed facts. It may have carried feeling. Imagine a mother singing to her child in a cave. No words, just soft coos and rhythmic hums. The child feels comforted. The bond deepens, or a group of hunters chanting together to build energy. The beat binds them, motivates them. This proto-language, often called the musical proto-language. Hypothesis suggests that music preceded speech in our evolution. It's not as strange as it sounds, even today. Tone matters just as much as meaning. We don't just hear what someone says. We hear how they say it. Anger, joy, sadness, all carried in the voice, not just the words. So maybe the first languages weren't spoken in syllables. They were sung in emotion. Eventually, humans moved from gesture and tone to symbol. Some of the earliest examples of symbolic communication come from cave art, in places like Chauvet or Lascaux in France. We see repeated patterns, dots, crosshatches, spirals. More than just art, these may have been proto-writing, and not just random scrawls. They often appear next to animals or scenes of life. Some archaeologists think they may represent tracking data, lunar cycles, or hunting stories. Think of it. A human reaches out, dips their hand in pigment, presses it to a cave wall. Not just decoration, but a message. I was here. This is what I saw. Remember this. The dawn of language written not in letters, but in marks. So what made our brains capable of this leap? Humans have unique adaptations that support language. A descended larynx, allowing more sound variety. Fine motor control over the tongue and lips. A brain region called Broca's area specialized. For speech production and an insatiable social curiosity, we're wired to watch faces, to track eyes, to crave connection. The social brain likely laid the groundwork for our communication revolution. Language didn't evolve in isolation. It emerged because we needed each other, to share food, to warn of threats, to gossip, to dream. Without community, there is no need to speak with it. Words bloom like fire. Even now, language isn't limited to speech. In sign languages around the world, people use hands, facial expressions, and posture to communicate with astonishing complexity. In dance, in ritual, in music hour, ancestors live on, even online, where text reigns supreme. We send emojis, GIFs, and videos that say more than any sentence, because language was never just about vocabulary. It was always about meaning, connection, understanding. We didn't invent language, we became it. We are still, every smile and sigh and raised eyebrow, reachers of expression. What if the people we call cavemen weren't as distant as we think? When an animal dies, it's left to rot. But when a person dies, something changes. Around 100,000 years ago, we begin to see evidence of deliberate burials. Graves dug. Bodies arranged, objects placed beside them, tools, pigments, flowers, even food. This wasn't disposal. It was ritual. The dead mattered. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. And again, this wasn't unique to Homo sapiens. Neanderthals buried their dead too. In Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal skeleton was found surrounded by pollen from local flowers, possibly laid there with intention. Think about that. What kind of mind does it take to mourn? To believe in an afterlife, or a soul, or something? Beyond the physical, these weren't empty gestures. They were messages to the living, to the dead, maybe even to the gods. Death, for early humans, wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of meaning. One of the most enigmatic artifacts from prehistory is the so-called Venus figurine. These small carved statues, often of voluptuous female figures, have been found across Europe and Asia. The most famous, the Venus of Willendorf, is over 25,000 years old. What were they for? Fertility idols, self-portraits, goddesses, pregnancy charms. Nobody knows for sure. But what's clear is that they meant something. The detail, the care, the frequency. It wasn't casual. Some are small enough to be worn or carried. Others were left in sacred places. And here's what's fascinating. They show a concept of the body as symbol. These weren't exact anatomical representations. They were abstract. They focused on what mattered most: hips, breasts, bellies, life, reproduction, creation. That's not just sculpture. That's philosophy. They weren't carving women. They were carving meaning. Want to hear the sound of 40,000 years ago? Try listening to the oldest known musical instruments. Flutes made from vulture bones and mammoth ivory. It's found in German caves. They play real notes, scales, harmonies, which raises a question. Who were they playing for? For ritual, for entertainment, for children, for gods. Whatever the reason, music is a uniquely human trait. It bonds us, moves us. And clearly, it's ancient. Try to imagine that moment. A small group huddled by firelight. Someone raises a flute, and a melody floats through the darkness. That's not survival. That's humanity. For every painting that survives, 1,000 have faded. For every figurine, 100 more turn to dust. For every song, myth, or dance, the vast majority are gone. Oral storytelling doesn't fossilize, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. In fact, many archaeologists believe that early humans had rich oral traditions, myths to explain. The stars, stories to teach morality, epics to guide migrations. We'll never know those exact tales. But the evidence is in the way they lived, how they buried, decorated, sang, carved. Maybe, and maybe, just maybe, some of those stories did survive, whispered from grandmother to grandchild, generation after generation, until they became the legends of gods and monsters we know today. The past isn't silent. It just speaks in a language we're still learning to hear. They were strong, adaptable, widespread. Some had bigger brains than us. Others had survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and predators we can barely comprehend today. So why did they all disappear? Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo luzonensis. The human tree was once crowded with branches, and yet only one remains. Us. What happened to the others? Let's examine the greatest vanishing act in human history. Neanderthals thrived in Europe and parts of Asia for over 300,000 years, longer than we've existed. They hunted mammoth, used fire, made tools, wore clothing, and even buried their dead. They were survivors. But around 40,000 years ago, they vanished, almost overnight, in evolutionary terms. At the same time, Homo sapiens were spreading across the globe, moving into Europe, following the Ice Age herds, carving out territory. And that coincidence has long raised one obvious explanation. We wiped them out. It's a seductive story, a Darwinian battle of brain over brawn. But is it true? There's little evidence of open warfare or genocide? Some competition may have happened, sure. But the fossil record shows something subtler: interbreeding, sharing of resources, maybe. Even cooperation in some regions. And yet one by one, Neanderthal sites go quiet? Could climate have played a role? Absolutely. The end of the Ice Age brought massive shifts. Forests replaced grasslands. Prey animals moved or died off. Neanderthal. Groups, already small and isolated, may have simply failed to adapt fast enough. It wasn't murder. It was erosion of numbers, food, time, a slow fade. It's not a final blow. If Neanderthals are the cousins we knew, Denisovans are the relatives we discovered by accident in 2010. Scientists sequenced DNA from a single finger bone found in Siberia's Denisova cave. What they found was shocking. A new species of human, genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens. We've never found a complete Denisovan skeleton. It's just fragments, teeth, a piece of jaw. And yet their DNA tells us they once spread across huge swaths of Asia, from Siberia to the South Pacific. And they didn't just vanish, they blended. Denisovan genes live on in modern people from Papua New Guinea Aboriginal Australians, and parts of Southeast Asia. Some of that DNA even helps with high-altitude adaptation, which is how some Tibetans survive in thin mountain air. So why did they disappear? Again, climate may be to blame. Rising sea levels could have wiped out island habitats. Shifting ecosystems could have fractured their range, or perhaps they simply merged with incoming Homo sapiens, slowly becoming genetically absorbed, till no distinct Denisovan group remained. Like smoke fading into mist, they were gone. Discovered in 2003 on the Indonesian island of Flores, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit humans, changed everything we thought we knew about evolution. 3 feet tall, tiny brains, simple tools. And yet they survived on a remote island until at least 50,000 years ago, maybe longer. They lived at the same time as modern humans, possibly after Neanderthals were gone, and then poof, no bones after a certain point. No tools, no signs of conflict, just silence. Could rising seas have isolated them even further? Did a volcanic eruption wipe them out? Did disease spread when modern humans arrived? Out. Or did we, intentionally or not, outcompete them? Some locals still tell stories of Ebugogo, short, hairy forest people who stole food and spoke in mumbles. If true, could these be echoes of real contact? We don't know. But what's clear is this: they were a completely different kind of human, and they disappeared without leaving a trace. Except mystery. In South Africa's Rising Star Cave system, a different kind of mystery unfolded, deep within a pitch-black chamber. Archaeologists found the bones of Homo naledi, a species that lived around 300,000 years ago. They had small brains, curved fingers, primitive skulls, yet their remains were carefully placed in hard-to-reach burial sites. Burial, ritual, intentional. How is that possible? These weren't advanced humans according to the traditional model, but they were doing things we thought only modern humans could do: organizing the dead, potentially lighting their way, navigating vertical shafts to perform a sacred task, and then extinction. We don't know when or how Homo naledi vanished. There's no clear timeline, no record of contact with other species. It's like they flickered into view, and then were gone. Could their environment have collapsed? Could predators or diseases have overwhelmed them? Or are there more of their kind still hidden in caves we haven't explored? It's a haunting possibility that our planet still holds the secrets of those who came before and faded. Without a word, let's step back for a moment. What if the disappearance of all these species, Neanderthal, Denisovan, Floresiensis, Naledi, wasn't just about them? What if we were on the edge too? Genetic studies suggest that around 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens experienced a massive population crash, maybe due to climate disaster, the eruption of Mount Toba, or an unknown catastrophe. We may have been reduced to just a few thousand. Breeding pairs. That's called a genetic bottleneck, and it means we were this close to vanishing too. But we didn't. We adapted. We spread. We remembered why us, and not them. Maybe it came down to flexibility in our diet, in our tools, in our social bonds. Or maybe it was just chance, a few more children born, a few more lucky migrations. History isn't always fair. Sometimes it's just a roll of the dice. Here's the question that keeps scientists and philosophers up at night. What if we're not the end point? We like to imagine ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution. It's the final chapter. But maybe we're just another version of humanity, the one that happened to survive. Others came before. Others vanished. And if history teaches us anything, it's that nothing lasts forever. Civilizations rise and fall. Climates shift. Species go extinct. We may feel alone on this planet now, but for most of our history, we weren't. And that knowledge should do more than humble us. It should connect us to Neanderthals, Denisovans, hobbits, and the unknown dead whose stories we'll never fully recover. They weren't failures. They were humans, just like us, and their disappearance is our warning. Picture this. You're standing on the shore of an island, thousands of miles from the nearest continent. The ocean stretches endlessly in every direction, No planes, no GPS, no sails. Just wind, water, and instinct. Now ask yourself, how did humans ever get here? Because somehow they did. Discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores, these tiny humans had small brains and stood barely over 3 feet tall. At first, researchers thought they were modern humans with a genetic disorder, but the evidence didn't fit. These were a distinct species. And what's wild? They lived until at least 50,000 years ago, maybe even longer. But here's the mind-blower. Locals on Flores still tell stories of tiny forest people, called Ibu Gogo, who stole food and whispered among themselves. Could they be echoing distant memories? Is it possible that some form of Homo floresiensis survived into recent history and simply vanished under the radar? It's speculative but not impossible, and it raises a provocative question. Could there be undiscovered human relatives out there in some remote cave or jungle, still waiting to be found? For a long time, science treated the story of humanity as a straight line, from primitive apes to modern humans. But discoveries from the past few decades have shattered that idea. Instead, we now see a chaotic, beautiful bush of evolution. Appeared, overlapped, mixed, and sometimes vanished. It wasn't a single path. It was a network of experiments in being human, and one of those experiments, ours, just happened to survive. But here's the thing. Superiority Neanderthals weren't failures. Denisovans weren't mistakes. They were real. They lived. They laughed. They loved. They endured. And in some ways, they're still with us. It's not just in our genes, but in the mystery of who we are. So when we ask what makes us human, what's the answer? Might be a little bit of everyone who came before us. For centuries, we've called early humans primitive. But what if that's the biggest mistake in all of archaeology? Because every now and then, discovery turns up that simply shouldn't exist. A tool too sophisticated, a technique too advanced, structure too precise. And suddenly, the timeline of human innovation doesn't just stretch, it bends. Could it be that early humans were using complex technologies, thousands, even tens of thousands of years before we thought possible? Let's open the toolbox and prepare to be surprised. Let's rewind to Africa over 2.5 million years ago. That's when we find the earliest known stone tools, the old down tools. At first glance, they might seem simple, flakes of rock with sharp edges, but they weren't random. Early humans selected specific types of stone, struck them at precise angles, and used them for cutting, scraping, and smashing. In other words, they were making multi-purpose tools. Fast forward a few 100,000 years and you get Acheulean. Hand axes, symmetrical, carefully chipped, and eerily consistent across vast regions. These weren't just useful, they were beautiful, shaped with care. Crafted with intention, it's like finding a perfectly carved sculpture from people we once called apemen. It wasn't trial and error, it was designed. Now jump ahead to the Upper Paleolithic, about 50,000 years ago. This is where things get wild across Europe, Africa, and Asia. You begin to see toolkits that rival anything from the early Bronze Age. There were bone needles, fishing hooks, harpoons, scrapers, and even composite tools, weapons made from multiple materials like stone, wood, and sinew. Think about that. It's one thing to sharpen a rock. It's another to engineer a spearhead, bind it to a wooden shaft with animal tendons, and harden it over fire. Some sites even suggest early humans created boomerangs, throwing sticks and bolus complex hunting devices that required both physical skill and mental planning. And yes, they worked. Our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were strategizing. Brace yourself for this one. In 1997, in a cave in France, archaeologists found a 7,000-year-old human skull with a perfectly round hole cut into it. No signs of trauma. Clean edges, healing around the wound. This was surgery. Specifically, trepanation, the oldest known surgical procedure, where part of the skull is removed. But it gets stranger. This wasn't a one-off. Dozens of trepan skulls have been found across ancient Europe, Africa, and South America, some as old as 10,000 years. Why did they do it? To treat head injuries? Mental illness? Rituals? We don't know. But here's the kicker. Many of these patients survived. That means Stone Age. People had not only the tools, but the anatomical knowledge and skill to perform surgery without killing the patient. No modern hospitals, no anesthetics. It's just raw human ingenuity and a steady hand. Primitive. Doesn't sound like it. Now, let's talk construction. You've probably heard of Stonehenge. But did you know it's not the oldest stone circle in the world? In southeastern Turkey, atop a dusty hill called Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists uncovered something breathtaking. Dozens of T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing over 20 tons, arranged in massive circular formations, intricately carved with animals, symbols, and geometric shapes. And here's the twist. It was built over 11,000 years ago, before agriculture, before metal tools, before cities. This wasn't a bunch of farmers stacking rocks. These were hunter-gatherers. And they moved, cut, and aligned megaliths before the wheel even existed. So how did they do it? We still don't know. No written plans, no heavy machinery. Just pure cooperation, vision, and perhaps knowledge that's been lost to time. It challenges everything we thought we knew about primitive people, because apparently they were building temples while others were still chasing antelope. Fire changed everything. But it wasn't just for warmth or cooking. Recent evidence suggests early humans knew how to control fire with incredible precision, using it to harden tools, clear land, manage herds, and even create glue. Yes, glue. Some Neanderthal tools show traces of birch tar, an early adhesive made by heating tree bark in oxygen conditions. That's chemistry. They didn't just stumble onto it. They had to experiment, refine, and replicate the process. And then there's fiber technology. At a site in the Republic of Georgia, archaeologists found 30,000-year-old flax fibers. Some dyed, some twisted into cords. It suggests weaving, rope making, maybe even nets or bags. So not only were early humans making tools, they were organizing their materials. It's not hard to imagine them with belts, pouches, slings, gear made from plants and leather, none of which survives today. We don't find it because it decomposes. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist. We've only scratched the surface. Here's a strange thought. What if early humans invented things that we've completely forgotten? Tools made from wood, leather, or woven grass that left no trace. Medicines from plants we no longer recognize. Techniques for navigating, building, crafting, passed on orally, never written down. In the blink of an evolutionary eye, these skills could vanish. One broken lineage, one generation lost, and poof, gone. We think of progress as a straight line, but history is full of false starts. It's very possible that ancient people had knowledge we don't because their world demanded it. Because their brilliance hasn't been fully recognized. We tend to think the past is dim, that everything older is simpler. But maybe we've underestimated them. Maybe the real story of early technology isn't a story of invention. Maybe it's a story of rediscovery. What would it take to leave a message that could last 30,000 years? No paper, no voice, just rock, pigment, and bone. That's exactly what early humans did. Not by accident, but by choice. Through symbols, sculptures, burial rituals, and paintings, they created a language that transcended time. A silent dialogue between past and present. These weren't just markings. They were expressions of fear, of hope, of meaning. Let's listen to what the stones and bones have been trying to tell us. Imagine stepping into a dark cave. The air is damp, the silence thick. You light a torch and suddenly the walls come alive. Horses gallop in ochre reds and deep blacks. Bison twist in motion. Handprints bloom like signatures. It's haunting, beautiful, emotional. This is Chauvet Cave. In southern France, home to the oldest known cave art on Earth, dating back more than 30,000 years. And here's the twist. The art isn't random. It shows movement, perspective, layering. Some animals were painted using natural rock curves to create depth. Some scenes depict sequences, like early animation. In short, this wasn't graffiti, it was storytelling. And it wasn't just in Europe. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, Ancient cave paintings, including a life-size depiction of a wild pig, date back over 45,000 years. It suggests something profound. The impulse to create was global. Art is not an invention. It's a human instinct. Look closer at some of those cave walls, and you'll start to see more than animals. There are abstract marks, dots, zigzags, crochets, spirals. Some appear over and over again in different places, even on different continents. Anthropologist Genevieve von Petzinger cataloged over 30 of these recurring symbols across prehistoric Europe, where she found blue mines. These shapes weren't decorative. They might represent a proto-writing system. We're not talking about an alphabet yet, but patterns, classifications, categories, maybe even early storytelling. Told in code, it's like stumbling on the punctuation of an ancient language, one that predates the earliest known writing by tens of thousands of years. Were these marks maps, calendars, clan signs, spiritual cues? We don't know. But here's the key point. Early humans were thinking symbolically. They weren't just reacting to their world, they were interpreting it. That's the foundation of language, of religion, of science, and it was already there long before the first civilization rose. Now let's talk about bones specifically. What people did with them. There's a particular image that comes to mind when someone says the word caveman. A shaggy-haired hunched-over brute with a club in one hand and a half-cooked hunk of mammoth in the other. Maybe he's dragging a woman by the hair. Maybe. He's grunting, barely able to speak, barely able to think. Sound familiar? This stereotype has been around for over a century, reinforced by cartoons, comedies, textbooks, and even museum dioramas. But what if that picture isn't just inaccurate but completely backwards? Let's break it down. The term caveman wasn't originally scientific. It came from 19th century ideas about primitive humans, especially during the period when Darwin's theory of evolution was rocking the world. People were struggling to place humanity in the broader story of life on Earth, so naturally, they leaned into visuals that were simple, digestible, and frankly a little bit insulting. The cave became a symbol, not of protection or shelter, but of primitiveness, ignorance, darkness. It was easier to paint early humans as mindless brutes than to consider that they might have been complex, emotional beings with art, tools, social structures, and even love. And here's the irony. While some prehistoric people did use caves, most didn't actually live in them full-time. Many early humans were nomadic, constantly on the move, building shelters, adapting to the environment. Caves were just convenient places to occasionally rest and, as we'll explore later, to create something extraordinary: art. So why has the caveman trope stuck so hard? It's because it's useful for comedy, for advertising, simplifying complex history into something bite-sized. But that oversimplification comes with a cost. We miss the astonishing intelligence and adaptability of our ancestors. Let's talk tools. Many assume that the earliest humans barely scraped by with sticks and rocks. But some of the tools unearthed from early sites, like the old Owen tools in East Africa, show intentional shaping, sharpening, even planning. Think about that for a second. To craft a proper hand axe, for instance, you have to visualize the final shape before you begin. You have to understand the angle of each strike. You have to know your material, how obsidian flakes differently from flint, and how one wrong hit could shatter your work. This isn't mindless hammering. It's design. It's forethought. It's engineering tens of thousands of years before blueprints even existed. And it didn't stop at stone. In regions of Europe and Asia, archaeologists have uncovered needles made from bone, complete with tiny eyes. For thread. That means early humans weren't just bashing things. They were sewing. Let that sink in. The stereotypical caveman might have worn tailored clothes. Okay, but what about language? Surely grunts and gestures were the only way to communicate, right? Wrong? Or at least, likely wrong. While we haven't found an ancient podcast recording or prehistoric diary, there are tantalizing clues that early humans had forms of symbolic communication far more complex than we imagined. Take cave art, some of the oldest examples, like those in the Chauvet Cave in France, date back over 30,000 years. The paintings show animals, hunting scenes, abstract shapes. But here's the kicker. They weren't just doodling. These images appear to follow patterns, styles. Even what some researchers argue are early forms of written code. It's not far-fetched to suggest that spoken language may have been in full swing long before we ever put a pen to paper. After all, the vocal anatomy, including the hyoid bone that supports speech, already existed in Neanderthals. And if they could speak, what were they saying? Were they passing on myths, teaching the young, singing? It opens a door not just to what early humans did, but who they really were, emotionally, culturally, socially. One of the most persistent myths is that early humans had small brains. But in many cases, that's simply not true. Neanderthals, for example, had brain sizes larger than the average modern human. That doesn't necessarily mean they were smarter, but it certainly means they weren't dumb. In fact, recent studies suggest they cared for their sick, buried their dead, may have even painted their bodies or worn jewelry. Does that sound like a creature without imagination? So why does the dumb caveman trope survive? Because evolution is often misrepresented as a ladder from simple to complex, from ape to human to us. But evolution isn't a ladder. It's a sprawling, tangled tree. Different branches coexisted, interacted, even interbred. Intelligence didn't suddenly arrive. It emerged in waves, with moments of brilliance stretching back further than we ever guessed. And the more we discover, the more we realize early humans weren't evolving into us. They already were us in many ways, just shaped by different challenges. So, what's the harm in a few Flintstones jokes? At first glance, maybe not much. But the myth of the caveman feeds into deeper misconceptions about humanity. It paints our ancestors as disposable. It's inferior, a prequel to the real story, rather, than the foundation of it. And it disconnects us from one of the most powerful truths. We are part of a legacy of survivors, innovators, artists, and dreamers. When we look at a handprint on a cave wall, it's not the mark of a primitive beast. It's a message. I was. Here, I lived, I thought, I created. Maybe, just maybe, they're asking us to remember, because buried beneath the soil, behind the symbols, and hidden in their DNA are mysteries we've only just begun to uncover. Picture this. You're standing on a grassy plain nearly 50,000 years ago. The wind is sharp. The air smells of smoke and earth. And across the valley, you spot another human tribe. But something's different. They're not quite like you. Stockier, broader noses, deep-set eyes. Their language is unfamiliar. Their tools. Slightly different? You're not imagining things. These aren't your people. They're Neanderthals. For tens of thousands of years, multiple species of humans walked the earth side by side. Not just Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, a surprising number of others. So what happened when they met? Let's start unraveling one of the most mind-bending chapters in the human story, the common. Myth is that Homo sapiens evolved, slowly got smarter, and wiped out everything else in its path. A clean, simple story. But reality? It's much messier. For a large chunk of history, the world wasn't just home to us. It was a living, breathing mosaic of human species, not ancestors, cousins, co-inhabitants. Imagine Earth like a global stage. In Africa, Homo sapiens were evolving and spreading. In Europe and parts of Western Asia, Neanderthals had already carved out a life in the cold, harsh climates. Meanwhile, Denisovans, a mysterious group known mostly from DNA and a few bone fragments, were thriving in parts of Asia, even as far as the Himalayas. At the same time, tiny hobbit humans called Homo floresiensis lived on Indonesian islands. They were barely over 3 feet tall and made tools that still baffle researchers. And here's the kicker. Many of these groups overlapped in time. This wasn't a handoff from one species to the next. This was a coexistence. So what happened when their paths crossed? For decades, scientists assumed that when Homo sapiens met Neanderthals, the outcome was inevitable. We outsmarted them, hunted them, drove them to extinction. But the truth is far stranger and far more human. In 2010, geneticists dropped a bombshell. Most non-African people alive today carry Neanderthal DNA. That means there wasn't just conflict. There was connection. Our ancestors didn't just encounter Neanderthals. They interbred with them. Intimately. Repeatedly. And not just Neanderthals. Either Denisovan DNA can still be found in people from Oceania and parts of Southeast Asia. So what does that mean? It means that these weren't others. They were us, in some way. The boundaries weren't so rigid. There were alliances, partnerships, even families formed across species lines, and yet the other humans are gone. Why, let's be honest. Extinction stories are seductive. They offer drama, finality, and a clear villain, usually us. But more, and more. Scientists believe the disappearance of groups like Neanderthals wasn't a simple case of genocide or competition. Climate change likely played a major role. As ice ages advanced and retreated, the world shifted rapidly. Food sources vanished, habitats changed, populations dwindled, and in some areas, Homo sapiens may have simply outlasted their cousins. With broader trade networks, better clothing, or more adaptable tools, we could move faster, survive longer. But here's a twist. What if extinction isn't the right word? What if Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't vanish, but were absorbed? Their genes live on in millions of us today. That means their story didn't end, it merged with ours. That's not a tragedy, it's a legacy. The idea that these groups just fought and bred misses something important. They might have shared ideas. Some archaeologists believe that. Neanderthals were already creating symbolic objects before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. Necklaces, pigments, even cave art. But after contact with modern humans, the evidence of Neanderthal creativity seems to explode. Could cultural exchange have taken place? Do we teach them how to shape tools differently? Do they show us how to survive in colder climates? We'll never know the full conversations. But the artifacts suggest something more collaborative, or at least more curious, than we once thought. These weren't mindless brutes. These were fellow humans with different bodies. Yes, but with minds full of potential, and we may owe more to them than we realize. Let's talk about a truly bizarre branch of the human tree, Homo floresiensis, sometimes called the hobbit humans. What if beneath the concrete, the screens, the schedules, we are still carrying them inside us? Their fears, their instincts, their joy at Freydrosch. For a meaning, for a tribe, we often think of early humans as them primitive, prehistoric, long gone. But the truth is more powerful, and maybe even a little unsettling. They're not gone. They're in here. Stand in front of a mirror, really look. The shape of your jaw, it's the ridge of your brow. The curve of your hands, in many ways, you're looking at an Ice Age survivor. Our skeletons haven't changed much in 40,000 years. In fact, if you dressed a Cro-Magnon in modern clothes and cleaned them up, they could probably walk through a city and go unnoticed. You might even recognize something in them. A glint of awareness. A spark of emotion. What we call modern is just a thin layer of paint over a very ancient design. Beneath your skin lives a person who once sat in caves, watched the stars, and whispered stories by firelight. We haven't just inherited their DNA. We've inherited their minds. Early humans lived in small groups, usually 20 to 50 people. It's about the size of a modern classroom, or a team, or a close-knit neighborhood. In these tight groups, survival wasn't about competition. It was about cooperation, and that structure shaped our psychology. We still crave closeness, still look for us versus them, still feel safest when we belong to a tribe. Our brains are built for connection over scale. That's why thousands of social media followers can't replace one true friend. Why loneliness feels like starvation, because to our ancient brains, it is we evolved to belong, to be seen, heard, held. And when we lose that, we don't just get sad, we break. So what happens? When a Paleolithic brain is thrown into a high-speed, always-on modern life? Stress, burnout, anxiety, disconnection. Think about it. Our ancestors had intense, short bursts of stress like running from a predator. but then rest, recovery, social bonding. Today, we're constantly under pressure. Emails, bills, deadlines, alerts. Our stress switch is stuck in the on position. Our bodies haven't caught up. They're still trying to hunt mammoths in a world of spreadsheets. No wonder mental health issues are skyrocketing. We're ancient minds in a hyper-modern cage bet, but recognizing that isn't a defeat. It's a map. It helps us understand what we really need: sunlight, movement, real food, real people, and maybe a little silence now and then. As we moved from tribes to towns to cities, something was left behind. We lost the slow rhythm of nature. We lost shared rituals, singing, dancing, storytelling, under the stars. We lost the sense of awe that came from watching the seasons change instead of watching the news. But we didn't forget. That's why we still go camping. Why we're drawn to fireplaces. Why a full moon can make us stop and stare without. Knowing why our ancient selves are still whispering, still reaching, not for a return to the Stone Age, but for remembrance, a reconnection. A reckoning with what it means to be human. And we're not just the children of one lineage. Remember, Homo sapiens didn't walk the earth alone. We carry Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan genes, echoes of lost tribes that left no name, only fragments in our cells. We are, quite literally, the blended children of forgotten peoples. So when you feel conflicted, torn between the need to roam and the need to settle, between logic and instinct, not broken, you're just many ancestors speaking at once. Our minds are layered with their dreams, their fears, their ways of life. They don't need us to become like them, but maybe to remember them, to honor the fact we are not separate from the past. We are the past, still unfolding. We began this journey in a cave, with firelight dancing on stone, with mystery and myth wrapped in the bones of the earth. We met the hunters, the painters, the tool makers, the dreamers. We listened to the songs of ancestors long forgotten. We watched them love, grieve, fight, adapt, survive, and now here we are,